Welcome, everybody, to the February Walk Massachusetts Network meeting. This month's meeting is being hosted in conjunction with MassBike. So thanks to Alexis for being here. And I am going to turn it over to our speakers who are going to be talking about the Micromobility Commission's report.
Awesome. Thanks, Brendan. Happy to be here alongside Jaclyn Youngblood. I'm Kris Carter. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at MassDOT. And in this capacity, have been staffing the Micromobility Commission over the last year that was chaired by the Secretary of MassDOT. And we're excited to sort of walk through some of these recommendations that came out of the commission today. Pass it over to you, Jaclyn.
Super. I'm going to share my screen, and while I'm doing that, I will introduce myself. I'm Jaclyn Youngblood, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Innovation. Kris and I run the lab at MassDOT. If you're not familiar with our work, we're happy to chat later offline. But as Kris said, today we're talking about the Special Commission on Micromobility, and we thought, what better way to start than with a pop quiz? So we'll do that, and then we'll give you a little bit of background on the commission in case you aren't already aware. We'll talk a little bit about one of the major recommendations that came out of the commission's work, which were the speed-based tiers for categorizing devices and attempting to be future-oriented. And then we'll highlight a few of the recommendations that the commission made. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So throughout the commission's about 1 year of meeting, they agreed that language matters and that the words that we use are important. And so we wanted to sort of put you in the commission member's shoes, and have you sort of grapple with some of the language issues that they were grappling with as well. So just pop into the chat if you wouldn't mind. What would you call this device? I'll go through this pretty quickly. So if you have the chat ready and available, what would you call this device? Okay, scooter, great. And how about this one? Okay, seeing a lot of moped, yep. And finally, how about this one? More scooter. Yes, power chair, e-chair, yes. So you can see a lot of different responses to this. And some people use the word scooter to describe all three of those. And so it makes it really hard when the language that we have in law doesn't match sort of colloquial everyday use, especially when it comes to things like reporting crashes and trying to make sure we understand which devices maybe put folks at higher risk in the event of a crash, or how can we sort of say which device goes where if we don't even know what we're talking about when we say the same word to each other. And even when we agree that this is a scooter, maybe, the thing that looks like what you think it might be could have very different performance characteristics. So the one on the left sort of looks similar to the one on the far right, but it goes a much slower top speed of 18 miles per hour versus the one on the right can get upwards of 50. And so those are very different vehicles to be encountering or devices to be encountering when you're out on a path, a street, in a bike lane, etc. Which one of these would you say is a motorized bicycle? You can just say left or right. Left, a lot of left. Yeah, and I think Kris and I would agree, and I think commission members agreed that it felt like the one on the left is a motorized bicycle. It's an e-bike, it has a motor, but it turns out in Mass General Law, at least, the one on the right is defined as a motorized bicycle. Our colleagues at the RMV have done a great job trying to clarify that by also saying or moped or AKA moped, but in law, it is called motorized bicycle. And again, that just leads to confusion among users, among law enforcement. And can also lead to confusion even when things look the same. So would you say that all of these are e-bikes? Yes or no? Yes, with a question mark. Yeah, I think that's how commission members felt in their first meeting, of just sort of grappling with what being presented, in front of them. Is it an e-bike? Is it not? It turns out the two on the left are, per Mass General Law, Class 2 e-bikes. So they top out at 20 miles an hour. They do have a throttle, and they have that 750-watt motor max. The one on the right would actually be potentially an off-highway vehicle if it has a PIN code, which is similar to a vehicle identification number or a VIN that we use to register vehicles. But some of the models of what you see in these sort of e-dirt bikes, they don't even have that kind of PIN code, so they can't be registered with the environmental police here in Massachusetts. So they wouldn't even be considered off-highway vehicles. It makes it really hard when you're looking at something that looks similar and you're not sure what to call it or how to classify it. So the commission really struggled with that and grappled with it. And that matters for us here in Massachusetts because we have seen a number of crashes in the past year or last year, some of which were fatal. And it's a tragedy, and it shows up in the way that the press reports about these. You see e-bike, electric bicycle, talking about these often younger riders who are in these fatal crashes. And in fact, none of the devices in any of those crashes were e-bikes according to current law. They were something else. But the way that we talk about them then maybe makes community members, residents feel unsafe when they start to hear, oh, e-bikes are allowed on this type of infrastructure, or you might encounter an e-bike over here, because they start to think about these types of maybe off-highway vehicles or other sort of higher speed devices that aren't actually a bicycle. So with all of that, that's sort of where the commission kind of started, was in that context. And so just to give a little bit of background, the commission was established by the legislature in late 2024 to do a series of things and make a series of recommendations. It was chaired by the Secretary of Transportation and had a number of members on it, 15 total, including WalkMass and MassBike named in the statute itself. And thank you to board member of WalkMass, Stephanie Seskin, for participating, and Galen Mook of MassBike for participating as board members, as well as city and town representation through the Mass Municipal Association, academics, law enforcement, others. They came out with 16 recommendations in the final report, which you can access, and we'll have a QR code for later. And I'm sure someone can drop the link in the chat. And one of those recommendations was to clean up some of that language that we just talked about, some of that confusion across device types, and used sort of speed as the defining characteristic for how to think about trying to be proactive in safety, knowing that a risk-based approach really needs to take into account speeds and speed differentials between maybe, say, a pedestrian or a young person who's, like a kid who's maybe on a bicycle with their family, and then maybe one of those sort of e-scooter, stand-up scooters that can go, maybe 30, 40 miles an hour. So I'm going to pass it to Kris to talk about the speed tiers, and then we'll go from there.
Awesome. So Jaclyn was just talking about how speed is something that can be easily identified. And I think the other things that we were thinking about with using speed as a classification device is it allows us to be a little bit future-proof, right? New devices are coming out every year. We're seeing different things on our paths, on our streets. And we want to make sure that whenever the next wave or whatever the next thing is, that we're able to sort of slot that in without having to redefine a very specific term that might then become outdated in the law at some future date. So speed is sort of where we landed. What I'm going to do now is walk through a little bit of that work on classification that the committee sort of grappled with this past fall. And so what you see here is the recommendation around bucketing these devices by speed. There are a series of tiers on that left-hand side, so a tier 0, 1, 2, and 3 that break out a series of miles per hour. So starting with tier 0, so that's anything that's 20 miles an hour and under. There's some subcategories there, A, B, and C, to help us sort of think through those. A is all the human-powered devices, so your regular bicycle or kick scooter. B is powered micromobility devices. This includes those class 1 and 2 e-bikes that go up to 20 miles an hour, but also could be those scooters or one wheels or hoverboards or other things that sort of fit in there. And then C is those sort of devices that were on maybe that first screen all the way to the right, those mobility aid devices, sometimes called EPA-MDs in law, but motorized wheelchairs and other things. Tier 1 is where we add class 3 e-bikes. Not currently defined in Mass General Law, but would bring those in there. Those, as many of you know in this room, go up to 28 miles an hour. And then we end up with powered micromobility devices in there too, and mopeds as well. And mopeds are already defined as going 30 or under. in the Commonwealth. Tier 2 adds limited use motorcycles. They are also defined in law currently. They go 40 miles an hour or under. And as a new category for powered micromobility devices, you see this sort of throughout. Each tier has that. And Tier 3 is where motorcycles and those powered devices sit. Again, breaking them out by speed with sort of these 10-mile increments, except for that first bucket and the last bucket. And once you're able to sort of categorize these vehicles by speed, it gives some legibility about what criteria maybe should sit with them. And there's a lot of sort of discussion and debate on that. I'm going to walk through three eye chart situations now. So this is the first of them. Um, and the first one here that we're sort of talking about in the recommendations is around what is the device required to have to be street legal? If I want to put this on the roadway, what does it need to be? Highlighted in yellow are anything that was sort of changed from current law. And so in this case, you can see those sort of speed tiers down that left-hand side, all the way 0 to 3. And the first thing in that first column is around a UL electrical standard and a UL battery standard in that second column. The commission heard from the former fire commissioner of New York City, as well as some Commonwealth of Massachusetts fire staff, to sort of talk about the risk of lithium-ion battery fires and what that was doing in structures in New York City, as well as other places around the country, and sort of the growth of those as a hazard. And decided that putting a UL or similar type of specification would be a prudent move here in Massachusetts, so that we are minimizing the risk to people that are charging these, in their home or in their workplace. The next thing sort of in yellow here is on motorcycle equipment. You'll see at the bottom column or the bottom row there, that powered micromobility device. And what this is requiring is that those sort of higher speed micromobility devices would need to actually have motorcycle equipment with them. They need to follow the pathway that includes an FMVSS and a VIN to be legal on public roadways. Many of them, or most of them, don't have that now. And so this is sort of a way of saying you can't use those on public roadways, right? Maybe on private property or in another off-road setting, you could, but not until they have that motorcycle equipment on them. And this is also mitigating against some like deceptive marketing practices where people are selling these devices and saying you can add these two things and make it street legal, but really it's sort of not going through that process. The last column that's sort of lit up in yellow here is around a speedometer requirement. So this would hit anything that goes over 21 miles an hour and over. Class 3 e-bikes as well as powered micromobility. From what we could tell in the commission's sort of work here, a lot of those devices are already equipped with that, but it's just sort of a recognition that people should know how fast they're traveling when they're going those speeds. All right, the next set of things to walk through here is where can the device be used? So we sort of laid out how do we make this device available to be used on the roadway or in pass, and now we want to lay out like where can it actually go? So again, things that are highlighted in yellow, and in this case, it's sort of removing permissions or clarifying some gray space in the law. So bike lanes, so that second column in, mopeds are currently allowed to operate in bike lanes. There was a lot of discussion about this. There was a feeling that the mass of those vehicles and the speed they can travel maybe wasn't welcome in the bike lanes. And that they were seeing, particularly in protected bike lanes where those are operating against the curb, pedestrians were really concerned about sort of this safety conflict when they're stepping off the curb. So there was a decision to sort of move mopeds out of bike lanes as well as those higher speed devices as you go sort of further down there that don't really exist in law now, but would clarify that going forward. Shared use paths, another place where that speed differential was very much a discussion. And the decision was that devices that can go over 20 miles an hour would not be allowed on shared use paths. Again, where they're sort of sharing that space with pedestrians, often children, or people just sort of recreational riding, those higher speeds were less welcome. And so trying to improve safety for all users by restricting them from those places. All right, the last chart here on speeds is, now that we've covered where they can operate, what's required of the user to actually operate them. And a few changes here. So in that first column, you'll see sort of that helmet law that exists right now for cyclists that are 16 and younger. It actually makes a helmet requirement for any device that goes over 20 miles an hour. The user must be using a helmet. We did speak with some medical professionals, and they were sort of seeing some uptick in the types of crashes that were happening and the severity of them based on higher speeds. And so this is sort of based on that, and then sort of national trends too. There's a requirement, the next sort of thing going across, a recommendation is around the age of the person operating the device. So again, anything going over 20 miles an hour, the recommendation is to have them be 16 or older. The next column around license and education is a little bit nuanced. For those devices that go 21 to 30, the feeling was that there should be some sort of education that occurs for people, maybe at point of sale or somehow through a registration or something, where they would be able to sort of like get a little bit more education or just sort of like some awareness about the device and its capabilities. But it didn't really necessitate getting a driver's license. And people felt like on the commission that requiring a driver's license might be actually a barrier to access to these types of devices that help people go about their daily lives. As you kind of go down that column, those higher speed things, things that are going 30 to 40 or over 40 miles an hour, there was a feeling that a license of some type is likely required. But the current Class M license for people that are operating motorcycles or a Class D for people that are operating, a passenger vehicle didn't probably fit what is needed for the education component for these devices. And so the thought is that this needs to be sort of worked out by the RMV and with input from lots of different stakeholders to figure out what the right training is for people using those higher speed devices. The next column is on insurance. It's really highlighting that because powered micromobility devices that are high speed aren't really defined anywhere in law now, but it would require some sort of insurance for them. And mopeds being added to this, while some mopeds do require insurance, if sort of the lender requires it, it's not a requirement for registration. So this would change that and make sure that those devices have insurance as well. The next column is on RMV registration. This is nothing in yellow here, but just highlighting that a number of these things the RMV already registers. So those mopeds, those limited use motorcycles, and those motorcycles. And for things that they don't already register, there was a feeling that there was a way maybe to do a lightweight type of registration. And that's sort of this concept on micro ID and decal. And the commission's recommendation here is to form a working group to sort of suss this out a little bit further. But a way to sort of identify those vehicles and their performance characteristics, because in crash reporting right now, we often get sort of a jumbled picture. They're not clearly identified. We have similar to the pop quiz that Jaclyn led us through, we have a hard time determining sometimes if it's a scooter or a moped or something else, or an e-bike or off-highway vehicle. And so the hope was to sort of maybe clear that up in the crash reporting by having this sort of decal that's affixed at point of sale or through an online registration, but certainly needs some more thought put behind it before it moves forward. We wanted to sort of just take a step back. There's a lot to go through all that speed classification work, but also sort of make sure that this is really talking about this is grounded in a broader sort of safe systems approach. So MassDOT has adopted the safe systems approach. I know a number of other municipalities have as well. But really the work that's coming out of this commission is also sort of focused on the safety. The charge to sort of do improve not only the safety, but like the ability to grow the use of these devices is really tied to like how can we integrate them as safe as possible into the transportation system. A big tenet of that is around safety being proactive. And so, I think we feel like those speed tiers allow for maybe, and the language changes, allow for a little bit of better ability to do communication campaigns, to do education in communities, to really sort of create a little bit more of a culture of safety and responsibility because people maybe now know what is required of them as a user and where those devices should be and at what speeds they're operated. as well as thinking about the entire transportation system so that, drivers and pedestrians also can sort of be expecting these vehicles in those places as well. Safer speeds, also part of that safe system approach, right? We talked a lot about speed tiers here already, but there's a few other things in there around capping the maximum speed allowed on paths, and then thinking about how we can do outreach campaigns and signage and all those types of things. Safer vehicles, that battery requirement hopefully makes those vehicles safer to be charged in your home or in your workplace or other places. And then safer people as well, right? Some of those requirements around age restrictions for really high-speed devices that are out there and making sure that people feel equipped with the skills and even the strength that they need to operate those types of things. So Jaclyn's going to walk us through a couple other spotlights here.
Yep. And then we'll wrap it up and see the chat really active. So thanks for engaging. So the first recommendation that we wanted to highlight from the commission was to improve and update the crash reporting and vulnerable road user, that VRU data collection. So right now, the crash data system impact, which many of you are probably familiar with, and the national system don't require reporting of crashes that don't also involve an operated motor vehicle. So if it's a pedestrian and a scooter user or a bicyclist and an e-scooter operator, that wouldn't necessarily get captured in the current system. You may have local EMS data that you could pull. The Department of Public Health might have some data. MassDOT did a project at one point with DPH to get some information out of DPH, but it took about 6 months. There's no sort of current scalable, reliable way to get information about micromobility involved crashes. And also, even when an operated motor vehicle is involved, as Kris mentioned, and as the pop quiz sort of alluded to, law enforcement often refers to the same device differently multiple times in the same crash narrative. It'll be a moped, and then it'll be a scooter, and then it'll be an e-bike. And that's understandable because, it's hard to know what you're looking at and what you're writing down when you're in sort of the heat of a crash. But it makes it hard for MassDOT engineers, for other safety advocates to say, we're noticing that there's a hotspot around, this intersection or this type of path with these types of devices by looking at the data. We're not able to do that right now. And so there's a whole recommendation around updating the vulnerable user section of the crash form with some of these new definitions in state law, if they are adopted by the legislature, as well as requirements to capture some of those micromobility only involved crashes. There's a recommendation around a sort of general education campaign, including law enforcement, other state and local stakeholders, the Safe Routes to School folks, local bike shops, to inform users about regulations, local ordinances, culture of safety, as Kris mentioned, with the safe system approach. But also within that recommendation, there was a thought that just a general sort of awareness around micromobility for the public, whether those are non-users, so folks who would never consider using micromobility devices, or folks who are driving, whatever the case may be, just a sort of general awareness around micromobility. And calling out specific audiences that the commission thought would really benefit from these types of education campaigns, particularly for users of micromobility devices, folks without an RMV issued license, including those who are too young to receive one, older adults, and people who speak or read languages other than English. So on the right there, you have very small screenshots that I don't think that you can read, but on the top, just to highlight that there is an Office of Grants and Research grant about municipal road safety grants, and in that tiny yellow box there that is completely not legible, there's funding for programs for pedestrian and bicyclist safety. And so, maybe there's a way for law enforcement to include micromobility in some of those sort of e-bike or, bicycle rodeo programs that they currently run, as well as some screenshots of a social media campaign that we're hoping to run here at MassDOT, just to sort of raise awareness now that the report is out and we've presented it to the board, just to raise awareness among the general public about what these devices are, the benefits, as well as how we can ensure that we're using them safely as part of our transportation ecosystem. Another recommendation about increasing funding for infrastructure. So, in particular, some grant programs that MassDOT runs. The Commission thought the Complete Streets funding program and the Shared Streets and Spaces funding program were good ones to identify, to ask the legislature to increase appropriations to those, to help municipalities grow their networks if they have already started on that journey, to transition from interim infrastructure treatments to more permanent ones, more permanent physical separation, or to start the journey, even if it means starting with temporary protection and temporary infrastructure treatments, and then ultimately transitioning to something more permanent. And also for MassDOT to continue to provide technical assistance and awareness and education about these grant opportunities and how they can be used to support micromobility. And then finally, another funding one, because the Commission thought it was important to hit on the goal of increasing usage of micromobility, that we need to acknowledge that that's going to require money and funding. And so a recommendation that the legislature should establish a reliable and sustainable funding mechanism to support publicly owned docked micromobility share systems, knowing that it can be hard to sort of cobble together the operating dollars necessary to provide this type of, in some cases, 24/7, sort of always available transportation option to people. Sometimes easier to get the capital dollars, but maybe more difficult to always know that the operating dollars will be there. And so the Commission wanted to say, if we think this is part of our transportation ecosystem, then we should fund it as such, and want to ensure things like public ownership and a real emphasis on those docked systems so that we don't run into some of the issues that we've seen in other places, and even here when we had a few free floating systems. Folks just felt like the docked systems were more sustainable, and the Commission received a presentation from the current operator of the Blue Bike system showing the number of devices you need in a dockless system as, I think, 3 or 4 times greater than the number that you need in a docked system to serve the same amount of trips. And so just from a sort of density of the network perspective, the docked systems made sense to the Commission. Also, just highlighting that as we're making these investments in paths and trails and sort of these complete streets treatments, that these investments in the devices to go on that infrastructure furthers the sort of return on the investment there. So just trying to thread together 2 different investments for the legislature to consider. Okay, that's a lot. But if you want more, there's more. There's a 116-page report that you can read if you have time and enough caffeine. You have a QR code there, and we can drop a link in the chat after. And knowing that 116 pages maybe isn't everyone's favorite number of pages to read, we also made a summary of the report, which is only 20 pages and has way more pictures, and the margins are wider and there's just fewer words. So if you prefer the summary report, you also have a QR code to that there, and we'll drop a link in the chat as well. And hope that you share it, engage your communities, your networks, folks on the street, folks on the sidewalk. We think the work of the Commission was really thoughtful and intentional, and they grappled with a lot of difficult topics. And you may disagree with where they landed, and some of them disagreed amongst themselves at certain points, and that's totally fine. That's part of the dialogue. So just looking forward to the conversation. And before we wrap up, just wanted to thank Commission members and MassDOT staff who supported this work over the last, over a year at this point. So you see the 15 Commission members there, as well as some folks who sat in as alternates when Commission members couldn't join, and to the MassDOT staff who supported the work of the Commission. So I think that's the end. Yes, it is.
Wow.
And maybe so that we can see your faces, we'll stop sharing this, because you don't really need to see the words reflection and discussion, probably. Or if you do, we're going to take presenter privilege and stop sharing so that we can see you. Okay.
Cool.
I'm going to, turn it over to Brendan or
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I just want people to know, like, the things that Jaclyn and Kris were saying at the end there, like, there was robust discussion among Commission members about a lot of the things that you were putting in the chat. And not everyone agreed. And I think that was, it was very evident that this is a complicated issue. And so I really appreciate the time and the effort that the 2 of you and other folks that supported you as well really took to get us to this place. Alexis, Emma, and I have been furiously cutting and pasting questions that people have been putting in the chat. So I'm just going to start in order of how they came in. The first one was from Bryce. Bryce asked, "What about non-human transport devices such as sidewalk or roadway robotics?"
Yep.
Yeah. A good question. We had to sort of initially put some things that were out of scope for the commission given the limited time. And so that is one of the things that we sort of said we would not be a focus for this group because we only had sort of 9 months once we got going.
Right.
But certainly a topic that should be discussed. Yeah.
Great. And I'm just to make this also happen, like I am pasting in the question that the person asked into the chat so people can kind of follow along with that as well. The next question comes from Daniel. Questions related to, actually, this looks like it got cut and pasted weird. So I'm going to skip to the next one. Emma or Alexis, if you could just check that second one. The next one comes in from Kyle. Kyle was asking, since a class 3 e-bike is visually indistinguishable from class 1 and 2, what is the proposed mechanism for applying this recommendation?
Yeah, I think that's where the micro ID would come in. So the tier one devices require a micro ID if they don't already have some other RMV registration, whereas the tier zeros don't. And so it's an imperfect solution, but I think the thought would be if law enforcement were to choose to be on some sort of infrastructure, a path, a lane, that they would be able to see, here's the micro ID, and you are or are not supposed to be in this place. Also for crash reporting purposes, to be able to say, okay, we know this was a class 3 or we know this was a tier 1 powered micromobility device that theoretically would be capable of going only up to 30, but the speed of the impact makes it seem like it was over that speed or something, and therefore we think maybe there was a modification to the device that shouldn't have happened, or whatever the case may be. So yes, agree, and commission members agreed that a class 1 looks like a class 3 because there's no throttle, and we know that you can modify devices in app, and people do that. And so what is the distinction between the classes anymore at this point? Certainly came up a lot. And that was kind of where they landed was, maybe the micro ID addresses it. Maybe the sort of general education campaign helps to address it, but really sort of acknowledging that the top speed in some of those more constrained environments should really be 20. And so that class 3 e-bike ability to go 28, even though of course you can operate it at 20 miles an hour. I think Galen's line was, we don't restrict Maseratis from school zones. So sort of same thing, but I think enough of the commission felt like the class 3 e-bikes, just the speed differential was too high.
Great. The next one came in from Daniel from Boston Streets. Had questions plural. So in case he wants to clarify on some of this, around micromobility and commercial use, are there recommendations in this report that include insurance requirements for commercial drivers and companies?
Yeah, I think the commission felt like similar to delivery robots and sort of the freight piece of micromobility, that they didn't have the time to fully dive into commercial use. It came up sometimes on widths. Some of the, New York City, Seattle, others that have these sort of delivery cargo programs. Obviously, we know Boston had Boston Delivers, but some of the widths being in certain types of infrastructure was a piece that the commission did discuss, but they really kicked it to recommendation 15, which is a future use study to understand things like workers' conditions for folks who are delivery operators, to think about some of the insurance requirements. There's obviously, municipal, local things that can be done there that Boston has done, but really wanting to better understand sort of what are the conditions in micromobility usage for commercial operations, but also wanting to encourage and promote that in some sense, because if the alternative is a large truck or a car-sized vehicle, that also has consequences and negative externalities, especially in urban areas. We know large vehicles account for disproportionate percentage of crashes relative to their share of registered vehicles. And so, there are benefits to having more commercial operations on micromobility devices, but of course, there are also things to consider and ways to do that thoughtfully. And the commission members just didn't feel like they could get there in 9 months.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would add to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary. It probably came up it was hard to dig into every single use case or like category. So really sort of stepping back and just focusing on the devices themselves instead of like what they are used for was sort of the approach.
Okay, the next is kind of similar to Kyle's question before, but I think it's enough of a difference that I'm going to ask it. Anna asked regarding Class 3, also with some e-bike brands, it's easy enough to unlock Class 3 speeds in what is sold as a Class 2 e-bike. And then there was a follow-up from Alexa. I suspect this will be based on engine size rather than software speed restrictions. Can you maybe talk to either of those pieces?
Yes,
Yeah. Well,
wattage.
feel free to,
No.
yeah. I think the wording in the report, but don't quote me on this, is like whatever the highest speed it can be
The
achieved
maximum too, yeah.
by that device. So if you buy it as a Class 2, but it can be unlocked to a Class 3, then it is a Class 3 device. There's still language. So the language in Mass General Law now for Class 1 and 2 is 750 watts. The recommendation is for Class 3 to also keep that at 750 watts. I don't know, was it nominal power? I never remember if it's like
I think it's nominal.
nominal power. Okay, so the motor might be able for like going uphill for sustained periods of time, be able to do something more than that, but nominal power, 750 watts. So presumably devices can't go much faster than 30 with a motor that size. But that's sort of I think the thinking around how you sort of constrain things that are maybe marketed as a Class 3, but can really go like 40 or 50 miles an hour is by the wattage.
And just to sort of put a finer point on that, some of those off-highway vehicles or wouldn't even be able to be registered as an off-highway vehicle because they don't have that PIN or that WMC, the manufacturer's code, have wattage up to 8,000 watts or have motors up to 8,000 watts. So the difference between 8,000 and 750, right, is like more than 10 times. And so they're clearly different types of devices and they're capable of different things. And so trying to build everything into that 750 and under, at least on the sort of e-bike side, and acknowledging, I saw someone mention something about the EU, I think they cap their motor power at 250, I want to say. And so that is already way less than what we're doing in terms of e-bike motors. And so, yeah, lots of trade-offs. And I think the commission in general didn't want to take a sort of like ban approach like we've seen other places do on certain things to say like you just can't have this type of device or you can't have it here at all. And so their way of sort of walking through that or threading that needle of saying, okay, yeah, it's a Class 1 or it's a Class 2, but it could be a Class 3. And then you could also like snip a cable and all of a sudden it can go 40 miles an hour. Like they didn't want to design for the 3% of cases that were going to sort of misuse the system, but rather to say we want to encourage these devices. We want to encourage them for short trips, especially for trips that would otherwise be taken by a car. And so what's the way to do that? And how do we navigate the technological advancement with our clunky legislative tools or other tools?
Great. This one's a short question, but it's from Toby. Does this mean there is no minimum age for tier 0 vehicles that could go up to 20?
Yeah,
That's the commission's recommendation.
that is correct.
Yeah. There's a question from Ann McKinnon. Safe Systems approach slide talked about context appropriate speeds and appropriate speed limit setting. How are context appropriate speeds determined and set? Are municipalities allowed to set their own speed limits? How? And I think maybe I can clarify this with like on shared use paths. I think that's more where the commission came down.
That's right. So, the Minuteman could have or does Bikeway have different speeds per different municipality, operation and ownership and their own context, saying, okay, this is a mixing zone with a lot of kids walking through, or there's a school, or there's a T station. Whereas, some other municipality could say something different, or even within the same municipality, looking at the Southwest Corridor, DCR, but operating within City of Boston limits in that stretch. You could say, there's some straightaway stretches where maybe it's okay to go 20. And then there's some other places where maybe you want to go 10 or 15. So the path operating entity was the language that the commission landed on, which is, again, a bit clunky, retains the ability to set lower than 20 miles an hour speeds, which we currently have on some paths. I think 15 is what we often see if it's not 20. But the sort of default expectation would be you should not be going faster than 20 here. It's inappropriate for the usage, for the context of people walking, people, young kids, people with their dogs, whatever the case is.
I'm trying to now like pin some of the questions together that are related to um, design and stuff like that. So here's another question from Daniel from Boston. Was there any research work into possible impacts on street design? For example, multiple micromobility lanes or other approaches to street and path design?
Get into it.
No. There's Jaclyn talked through a little bit of the recommendation on infrastructure, but not specific actual design work. I think there was some discussion that like at some point we were talking about
Yeah.
8 to 10 feet of space, maybe allocated to pedestrians and micromobility devices on roadways. But those cross sections are often 40 or 50 feet. And so maybe we should be rethinking how we're using the entire space from building front to building front, if we're trying to enable more of this activity and separate different different speeds, right? If we're trying to separate pedestrians from e-bikes and other things. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here. There's a lot of a lot of really amazing people in this room that have been saying that for years and do that in their daily work. But that did come up as a discussion point.
It also came up in the Complete Streets and Shared Streets and Spaces funding increase recommendation, where the commission members were talking about, okay, so we want more sort of separated and protected facilities, and when they're interim, we want them to be more permanent. But also, maybe you could have streets where the general travel speeds are just lower, 15 or 20, and then folks would feel more comfortable using, a non-e-assist or a non-e-bike in that environment on a regular street that doesn't need its own dedicated infrastructure, that might not be as expensive to build out with all the concrete and the things and the protection. And so there was general discussion of sort of overall traffic calming and overall lowering of speeds of everyone, including drivers, to create more comfortable infrastructure for micromobility users, for pedestrians, and for drivers who have more time to react when they are going at lower and slower speeds. So
I think that's very responsive to things that both Ralph Walton and Nina asked during the chat as well. So like I'm just posting both of those comment questions in here. Nina said speed's a wonderful way to divide it. 18 miles per hour seems like a better end to the top tier since that allows eye contact. And Ralph said would feel more comfortable with a lower speed where bikes mix with pedestrians around 14.5 miles per hour. That's half the kinetic energy of 20 miles per hour. So,
Yep.
Great. And Louisa Gag had a question. She hopped on recently, so she wanted to make sure, did we already talk about battery charging and storage? It seems like there's not much in the recommendations about that. Does the commission have any guidance for municipalities in setting fire code regulations, guidelines for design and educational campaigns, etc.?
Don't think they discussed anything guidance for municipalities. It did come up a little bit in the recommendation about mobility integration plans, both for the MBTA and the RTA, the 15 RTA. So the T has already put out its mobility integration plan. It had put it out when the commission was sort of considering its work. So a commission member had recommended that sort of approach, then saw that the T had already done one and said, okay, let's make sure that the other RTAs are also being included in that conversation and could be looking at their assets. What is sort of intermodal hub charging opportunities? What is safe storage? Which devices can people bring on which types of transit, trains, buses, et cetera? And so I think that's the place it most clearly came up in terms of battery storage, battery safety.
Great. The next one is about how do we quantify these things? Julianne Chambers says, have you heard of any advances in traffic count data collection that would be more specific about the type of device, e-bike, scooter, etc.? Current traffic count information is limited to PEDs, bikes, motorcycles, variety of vehicle classifications.
outside of doing manual hand counts, and even then, to your point on doing a pop quiz where all these three things look the same, have not, and there's some people in this room that might know better, but have not seen anything that allows us to differentiate by like class of vehicle, other than the speed maybe it's going, but that doesn't necessarily give you a definitive answer.
Right. Yeah. Once again, it's challenging,
Yeah,
like
it's hard. Yeah.
especially with things in movement. So yeah, it's definitely I I attended many of these commission meetings and like my head was spinning after the first one where Bonnie Poland and others from MassDOT were, sharing some of the different devices that people are encountering and the admittedly understandable ways that police officers and first responders were documenting them. So,
Yeah,
uh,
and I think in that first meeting, Bonnie went through a couple like crash reports where even within the same crash report,
Yep.
a device gets called two or three different things, which, in the narrative. And so it makes it hard to figure out what's actually happening and where it's happening. And so hopefully that recommendation that sits in the report will move forward to help us clean up some of that data and also create new data where it doesn't exist now because only crashes with motor vehicles
Right.
get reported
That's right.
currently.
right. Yeah, I think that's an important piece. The recommendation here is also like if there is a crash involving a person on a e-bike and another e-bike, like now that there's recommendations here that can actually be tracked and logged and reported. Or if like a person on a micromobility device crashes into a person running, like those can be tracked as well.
Or a car door. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
yeah, right. Another one I think I just put in the chat. Yeah, from Carmen. How are you distinguishing between moped and higher capacity e-bike beyond appearance? Current RMV moped description seems like it would include a lot of e-bikes.
Hmm. So the current moped definition has like a size of the
The engine.
motor, to, right? A
Yeah.
50 cc requirement along with it. Well, so I think it's differentiated there. I'd have to go back and like look at the actual definitions in the report to
Yep.
answer that succinctly,
Yep.
because we do sort of go in and define. We'll like leave the motorized bicycle, but redefine it as a moped.
But I think in that definition it says excludes class one and two
1, 2
e-bike.
e-bikes.
I
I think
think
it's in there that way.
it's been a
Yep.
minute since we looked.
So there is your prompt to go read 116 pages and find the answer to that question.
Great. I'm trying to close the loop on some of these questions, but we got a great question from Don from the Metro West here. What is the definition of sidewalks? I live in a community that's building shared use paths, ignoring current standards by calling them as sidewalks in state grant programs, including Safe Routes to School.
Yep.
What is a sidewalk? What is a bike lane? I feel those questions were debated a lot during.
Totally. And I think it was a surprise to a lot of us that shared use path was not a term in Mass General Law as well.
Yep.
Despite us all thinking that it was something we could point to,
Yeah.
but didn't exist.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Mm.
Concrete? Something?
Yeah.
I think there was some.
Is there an actual definition? It shows up in the design guidelines, but I don't think it shows
Yeah.
up in MGL.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I've got two related questions that I'll put in the chat at the same time. Is from Pat Bibbins. How can bike clubs and advocacy organizations promote the report? And from Ann McKinnon, what are the next steps? Which legislators requested this commission, and what will she or he do with the recommendations?
Amazing. Which one do you want to take first? Yeah.
I don't know, do them in order.
Okay, great. Yeah, advocacy organizations. So I think sharing the report, sharing the summary version is probably easier, but certainly share the full report. Engage in local conversations about it, whether that's with your municipal officials and staff, and see what is currently being done. If there's things that you can sort of encourage them to take from the report that doesn't require legislative action. If there's things that they can reach out to MassDOT for to get support or technical assistance on, if there's grant programs that they can go after that they aren't currently, or if they want to use their Chapter 90 dollars, a small portion of their Chapter 90 dollars in some different way. Certainly talking with your local electeds, your local MPO, your regional planning association. I think the more we can sort of socialize, especially the kind of culture change or kind of behavior parts of the report, the more people who are talking about it, I think commission members would agree, the more we can get to a place where we can say, yeah, the sort of 20-mile-an-hour speed differential of like a 25-mile-an-hour bike versus a pedestrian or a runner maybe is not appropriate. And so we should slow down around users who are going more slowly. So I think that's one step. Talk about it with young people, talk about it with older adults. Micromobility, especially in the sort of share systems, is growing. It seems like it's here to stay. So having a non sort of head in the sand approach is probably good. Um, and there will hopefully be legislation, which kind of gets to the second
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
The statute said, please make recommendations back to the legislature. And so that is what the commission did. A bunch of them are targeted toward the legislature to pick up,
Mhm.
adapt,
Mhm.
adopt. And so when and as there are legislative hearings about some of these topics, go, bring people with you, testify, talk about things.
Uh,
Don't know specific. I think it
Well,
was
I
just
would say,
included in.
like, and good question.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, the two Transportation Committee
Yep.
co-chairs were on this commission.
Yep.
So Senator Crichton and Rep. Arciaro, and they were very engaged, as were their staff. And I know Senator Crichton and Rep. Arciaro have both said this is a topic that people come up to them in the grocery store and talk about. And so they are well versed in this, and I think they were excited to like have this commission and see the work and then get the final report, and excited probably to move forward with that in the way that they can. But it doesn't mean that all the reps and senators across the Commonwealth have heard the same thing, because they've been deeply engaged. So in your community, certainly talking to whoever your local representative is about this topic, if it's something you want to, that education is important, I think, because they're certainly going to be talking about it in session
Mhm.
going forward. And if there is some legislation that emerges from this, that would have public hearings and other things. And so doing that work now is always important.
Great. I think there are some follow-up questions in the chat related to those things, including from Christian Milnia from Streets Like Mass. I'm curious if there are any lawmakers who have expressed interest in introducing legislation that would implement any of the recommendations. Nina says, I'm sure Brownsburger would be. Um,
I mean, I think just to sort of second what Kris just said, Senator
yeah,
Crichton and Rep. Arciero were on the commission.
yeah,
They and their staffs participated in all of the meetings, and I think they were very interested in doing something with what came out of the report in a timely fashion. So, hopeful that we'll see something on that front.
great. Jaclyn, could you reshare your screen that has the QR codes for the report?
I can.
So,
And I saw
because
that our colleague Oos dropped the links into the chat as well.
yeah, and Mark Chase put in the chat. Did you post the link to the report and short version of the chat if you could repost so it's easy to find? So here are QR codes if folks want to take them. We can also email this out to everyone that joined today and RSVP'd. We'll be posting the recording to YouTube as well so people can catch it. Um, I think we'll leave it at Karen's. She may have already dropped off, but she said we need a more life-friendly term than micromobility. And follow-up note, very true. Found sometimes saying multimodal in public meetings itself can cause confusion. So
Yeah.
Yeah, fair.
don't disagree. Well, Jaclyn and Kris, thank you so much for all the work you did on this, and also for taking all the questions today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks,
And I will
Brandon.
say, not everyone agreed on things, and like there was some healthy discussion related to a bunch of this stuff. I I really appreciated how you led everything. I think did you call it a recommendation potluck? What was
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Yep.
And
Um,
Brendan, if folks want to see the recommendations that were brought to the potluck by commission members, it's in the appendix in the full report. It's one of the appendices. So you can see everything that commission members recommended. And then there's a sort of note about the methodology. I'm using air quotes because it wasn't super rigorous, but the way that we arrived at the 16 was from that initial list of over 100 that the commission members recommended and put forth. And so you can see sort of what they put out there and then what didn't rise to the level of enough consensus and enough of a majority or at least a plurality to make it to that sort of sweet 16. We like to mix a bunch of metaphors here. So yeah, just a note on the sort of things that were left on the cutting room floor you can find in the appendix.
Great.
Brendan, thank you, and MassBike for putting this on and assembling like an amazing room. I'm like looking at the names of these rooms. These are like my like transportation heroes dotted through here, or people that I've gotten to work with in the past that do amazing stuff. So thank you for pulling this together.
For sure. Yeah. It was, great partnership between MassBike and Walk Massachusetts as always. So, all right. Thanks everybody. And we're letting you off right at 2 p.m. This is wonderful. So
Well done.
thanks so much.
Cheers. Take
Bye.
care. Bye.
Thank you.